Hi everybody, how are you tonight? Thank you for being here. I am Michelle Perrin, and it's really my pleasure on behalf of all of us here at the DIA and FMCA to welcome you to this combined CCS-DIA event tonight. As I hope you're all aware, this is the second event in the Friends of Modern Contemporary Art's year-long series entitled Which Side Up? What Moves Contemporary Art? It's really a multi-part case study focusing on the intermingling subcultures that constitute today's art world. So we're hoping that these fascinating events will provide a holistic view of the people, places, and organizations that propel the art world forward. Sarah Thornton's best-selling book, 7 Days in the Art World, was the inspiration for this series and really serves as a springboard for our sorting of the themes. In September, we opened the program with our prelude, which was called Unpacking the Concept, where contemporary curator Rebecca Hart presented an informal primer on Which Side Up. Tonight's event, Starting the Conversation, Art School, the Crit, and the Biennial, looks at how curators and artists are challenged to find common ground in the language that describes emerging new work. By addressing rapidly changing strategies in the assessment of art, this event looks at the conversations that begin in art school and continue to inform such career milestones as biennials and museum shows, ultimately revealing the exchange of ideas and collaborative process that exists between curators and artists. The next event in the series takes place on Sunday, November 21st at 6 p.m. Oh my gosh, never mind. Sunday, November 23rd at 6 p.m. And this really serves as the Friends of Modern Contemporary Art's annual meeting, and you're all welcome to attend. And it will be a talk by the author and sociologist Sarah Thornton, who of course wrote 7 Days in the Art World in 2008. And since that time, she has directed her focus on the role of the artist in the 21st century. And that is through her newest book, 33 Artists in 3 Acts, which is actually due to be published and released in early November. And here in this book, she speculates on such notions as whether being an artist is a radical form of entrepreneurship or a vocational calling like the priesthood, and I know there's a lot of artists in the room that could discuss that tonight, and whether working as an artist is an extension of philosophy or an offshoot of entertainment. So be sure to come on Sunday, November 23rd for that talk by Sarah Thornton. I really want to give a shout out to the Friends of Modern Contemporary Arts Program Committee for working so tirelessly on this year's program. So in addition to my colleague Gerhard Nodell, the committee also included Jim Lucky, Sandy Seligman, Susan Campbell, Amy Canchis, Lisa Niederlander, Linda Watson, and of course our fearless leader, Rebecca Hart. And now I'd like to introduce Rebecca Hart, and she's going to introduce our esteemed panel tonight. And so please join me in welcoming Becky Hart to the podium.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome to everyone here tonight. It's really exciting to see this many people turn out on a weeknight for a program like this. I also want to echo Michelle's generous thanks to the Friends of Modern and Contemporary Art and to the work that Michelle and Gerhard have done to bring this series to you, and also to Lisa Niederlander for her leadership. Before I begin with the panelist introductions, I'd like to recognize someone who has quietly worked behind the scenes to help produce FMCA programs for 8 years. I believe 9 years, and that is Taria Stanford. This week we learned that the curatorial responsibilities are being shuffled, and tonight is the final program that she will support for Friends of Modern and Contemporary Art. Now, many of you don't know her by sight, but when you call and when you email, she's the person who picks up the phone, who responds to you. She's the person who works behind the scenes to make sure that everything flows smoothly. And I'm not sure she's in the room, but I'd like you to join me in offering a round of Astoria of applause. Please stand. Next slide, please. Tonight's program, we have three esteemed speakers. But before, I also need to talk to you about a four-letter, kind of dirty word. We click through these next four slides quickly. RSVP. Okay, the last event, 18 people responded and 120 people attended. I was thrilled. But you can imagine how we're sweating it to figure out whether we have enough seats in the room and whether we have enough food on evenings that we offer food. Please respond. We have a web page, dia.org/whichsideup, and on the page there is it says click here for a ticket. Please let us know you're coming. I'm concerned that someday we're not going to have a seat for everyone. Next slide. And finally, the DIA is interested in what you think. We have a Survey Monkey, and this is also on our website. Please go to it and tell us what you think about our lectures. Next slide. Okay. I'm going to introduce the three speakers, talk a little bit about the program, and then turn the panel over to Sarah Turner, our moderator. Michelle Grabner is known most recently for being one of three curators for the 2014 Whitney Biennial, but she is also an accomplished writer and artist. In Chicago at the School of the Art Institute, she's professor of painting and drawing, and she has taught also at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Cranbrook Academy of Art, the Milton Avery Graduate School of Arts at Bard College, and the University of Pennsylvania. Her work is presently on view at James Cohan Gallery in Chelsea, New York, and it is a comprehensive presentation of Michelle's work to date. With a career spanning over 30 years, Michelle Grabner has dedicated herself to identifying, indexing, and transposing patterns. Her mother tongue is that of abstraction, and her vocabulary comes from the domestic materials that are close at hand. Grabner came to age as a painter during the 1980s, an era of questioning and appropriation. But it was through her use of tablecloths, bed linens, and blankets was less about the signifiers and more about the impulse to copy. Pedagogical theory, ideas of making and remaking, inheriting knowledge and passing it on, grew in her practice alongside her work as a longtime educator. When her son Peter returned from home one day with a kindergartner's project of two-color paper weaving, Grabner decided to make it her own. After 20 years, she continues to make these weavings, which not only underscore her concepts about elemental compositions and process, but also seem to satisfy another impulse, productivity. Not only does she serve often as a curator, but Grabner, along with her husband, Brad Kellum, founded the Suburban in 1999 and Poor Farm in 2009. The Suburban is an artist-run space in Oak Park, Illinois, and over the past year has hosted numerous projects by major artists and emerging artists. Poor Farm is a nonprofit exhibition space in rural Wisconsin. We're thrilled to have Michelle here as the curator, as an educator, and as an artist. Thank you for joining us. After graduating from College for Creative Studies, Kevin Beasley immediately joined the faculty there and at the same time co-founded Cave, an artist-run gallery in Detroit's Russell Industrial Center. After that, Beasley went on to Yale School of Art, where he earned a Master's of Fine Arts, where he worked in multiple disciplines, including sculpture, sound, and performance. His sculptural installations are typically composed of found materials such as glass, roots, metal, and fabric. The sculptures evolve out of an inventive, performative process that incorporates found materials, including the artist's own clothing, and incorporates them into sculptural objects. Beasley gives structures to these materials using a mixture of polyurethane foam and resin. As the compound sets and hardens, the artist pushes and molds the object into their presentation formats. His sculptures trace the movements and actions of the artist's body, while also themselves resemble bodies or flesh, though fragmented or dismembered. Reworking traditions of process art and assemblage, Beasley's sculptures are rooted in the personal and practical context of their materials and in the urban, post-industrial landscapes in which the artist has lived, including Detroit, New Haven, and New York. In 2003, Huffington Post named Beasley as one of 30 Black artist makers under 40 that you should know. This recognition came while he was artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Kevin, thank you for being with us. And in a certain way, I don't need to introduce our moderator, Sarah Turner, but I want to anyway, because, you know, a prophet in their own land, it's really great to know what other people do. After work and study in the liberal arts, studio arts, and academic administration, Sarah Turner is now Dean at Cranbrook Academy of Arts, a position she has held since 2013, following a succession of academic and administrative roles at the Academy. Before coming to Cranbrook, Turner was a visiting faculty member at Rhode Island School of Design and the State University of New York at New Paltz. Turner maintains a low-production studio in Pontiac. The production of her studio has been featured nationally and internationally. Her studio interests combine applied art, craft, and design with a particular focus on explorations of everyday objects and simple materials. Turner is a graduate of Smith College, where she studied sociology. She has a certificate from the Oregon College of Art and Craft, and she studied metals, where she earned her Master's of Fine Arts at Cranbrook Academy. Sarah, we're thrilled to have you with us. Tonight's panel discussion is an attempt to reveal some of the conversations that happen between artists, their mentors, and curators. They're critical conversations that help form the language and the critical thought around artworks. Our panel is well acquainted with the process of art school critiques and what happens in this process, which is later mirrored in conversations and discussions between artists and curators or art historians. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that turns to us. How's the sound? Is my mic on? Yeah? Someone wave at the back if it sounds pretty good. Yeah? Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll try to speak up, and I think the AV booth will try to adjust me a little bit, and then we should be in good shape. Well, thank you, Michelle and Becky and Gerhardt, for working with your groups tonight to bring us all together. It's really a refreshingly straightforward, thoughtful, and I think really useful series, this arc that we'll have over the course of the fall and winter as we look at all of these areas within the art world. Welcome, Kevin and Michelle, back to Detroit, and thanks for being with us tonight. It's great to have your experiences and your point of view in the conversation. And I also wanted to thank the audience for coming. I know that as I look out over the audience, I see artists and collectors and student artists and teaching artists and curators and critics and writers and academics. And if it weren't for all of those people playing really vital roles in a community, none of these conversations would be very productive. So thank you for coming, and thanks for all that you do to help set the stage for the conversation that we'll have tonight. As you know, we're sort of the starting point, and so we're going to start where a lot of artists start, which is conversations in art school, and specifically we'll be starting to talk about conversations called critique, which I know many of you are very familiar with. So this is one beginning, and that's where we'll start. So I'll turn to the two of you, thinking about your various roles as artists and educators and curators. Could you help us pull back the curtain on the art school critique? I think it sometimes has a certain mystery. I think art students know it well, but other members of the community don't know it as well or as directly. So if you could talk to us a little bit about what are the aims of, do you think, of critique, and how do those conversations get where they need to go?
Sure. This is why we're here. This is a great question. Do you want us to go through our introductions first?
I
do. So Rebecca gave us an amazing introduction. So I feel like I'm just going to give you the illustrated version of exactly what Rebecca said. So I'm going to launch into this quickly, and then we will.
That sounds good.
Kevin is going. Okay, so just a little bit, again, I'm giving you some, and this is what's so interesting about tonight, because critique is about both the thing itself, the studio, the artist, but it's also language. So Rebecca set me up with some language, and now I'm going to kind of walk you through and give you some visuals in terms of what the suburban looks like and so forth. But I'm starting out with some infographics that I had made to be included in the Whitney Biennial catalog, because for me it was really important that as an artist, being the first artist who curated the Whitney Biennial, it was important for me to be as transparent as possible. I have had visits by biennial curators before as an artist, and the whole thing was shrouded in a great kind of mystery, and I didn't want that to continue. I really wanted to be forthcoming with artists. So you can see very clearly where I visited, where I didn't visit. There's a little note on Michigan here, so I did get to Michigan. Teaching was important to me, and I think in terms of this infographic, the thing I'd like to call attention to is all the artists that I worked with before. That was really important in terms of organizing the biennial for me. Some people may call it a conflict of interest. Some people may think it was predictable that I would work with some of these artists, but quite honestly, I worked with 53 artists in a biennial that included 103 artists. Some of those artists, I had to understand their working process, their methodology, their language. I didn't need to know what they were going to make or how that conversation what it would yield, but it was very important for me that I had a base with these artists. So then I could go to studios, I could visit artists that I've never known, are new to me. So that was important. So when you have exploration, you also have to have a kind of a base. Also, you'll notice that in terms of age, most artists that I included were older than myself. So it was really important for me not just to, I wasn't interested in bringing in new talent. I wasn't interested in going out looking for new talent. I was quite interested as a teacher, as a professor, to actually look at teachers in schools who are informing and influencing young talent. So that was important to me. So anyways, that's what this is about. I'll walk you through just a couple installation shots on my 4th floor. When you got off the elevators on the 4th floor, you saw a portrait by an artist that I've worked with before in Chicago, Dawood Bey. And this is a portrait that he took of President Obama in 2008. So it wasn't even within a 2-year time frame of the biennial. It was important for me to set up that curriculum, the idea of organizing or curating around the idea of curriculum building and how expansive that could be. And if any of you went to public school, you remember that there's the president who graces your classroom. So it was important for me to set forth a common denominator and to start thinking through what that is in terms of the selections that I made. I built the 4th floor around 2 big cacophonous galleries. This is a gallery that I made reference to as Forest of Signs. It's work that deals with appropriation, that deals with media. And you can see Sarah Charlesworth, you see Shauna Lutker in the main center, and then you see Gretchen Bender on the side. And then the other kind of big cacophonous space was really this collapse between high and low, craft, the insertion of craft. You see Sheila Hicks's work, David Robbins' desk. David Robbins considers himself a contemporary imagination, not even an artist, but then also an emphasis on painting, including Laura Owens and Jacqueline Humphreys, but also Sterling Ruby ceramic basins. And I thought it was very important that actually painting by women would set up and support Sterling's ceramics. An off-site piece, which I quite like because I think many of you were included in it, maybe unknowingly. This is Tony Tassett's Artist Memorial, and it had nearly 500,000 names of artists who are working today. So my learning arc going through the biennial process as an artist, the first kind of hurdle was this was not going to be a fair curatorial process. I could not include what I wanted. So Tony did. Tony included the names again of 500,000 artists. So they're all etched along on these panels, and it was set up on 17th Street at the Hudson River. Quickly, the show that opened up last week at James Cohan Gallery. I can go into some of those tenets, but maybe we'll do that when we're talking about crits. I think it would be better to fold it in. So I want you just to take a look at this hanging thing. This hanging thing supports my silver point, my painting. And then on the back side, it's a Janus face to some degree. So it's a giant mobile. And what hangs on the back side is my support system. There's a large photograph of me and my 3 children and my husband, my daughter's chair cast in concrete, and her table that sits in the studio as well. So this is really the support system that allows this Chelsea thing to happen. And a studio practice to happen, quite honestly. This is another gallery at the James Cohan, and you can see the paper weavings that Rebecca was making reference to in the introduction. The Suburban, this is one of 2 spaces, relatively small spaces in Oak Park that we call the Suburban. This is our 15th year. You're looking at actually an installation by a collective called Consortium that comes out of Dusseldorf, where they wrap text around the little space out in Oak Park. Here would be an example of an installation. We have Walid Beshti and Jim Welling, 2 artists who decided to work together. Often it's just one-person shows. So, over the 15 years, we've worked with now 300 artists. And they come, they stay with us. So it really is kind of embedding oneself in a suburban household outside of Chicago. And this is the Poor Farm. This is the exhibition space, the artist-run project space we run in Wapaka County, rural Wapaka County, Wisconsin. 50 miles directly west of Green Bay. So it's the Suburban's rural cousin, where exhibitions will last a full course of the year, and the Suburban, they rotate every couple weeks. And this is a piece by Paul Drickey. Paul is an artist based in Milwaukee. I included him in the biennial, and he created this large plaque that is mounted in front of the in front of the Poor Farm. And I won't get into the history of the Poor Farm, but it's a lost history. Some of you recall maybe Grandma saying, watch your pennies, otherwise you will end up at the Poor Farm. It's a history that we don't know. The American Poor Farm system and the relationship to means. It's a very timely conversation when we're talking about the 1%, and we're talking about economic structures. So the Poor Farm is a history that deals with this. And here is an installation of a Gretchen Bender exhibition that we mounted in 2012. And so you kind of get a sense of the raw space. And I'm very proud of this exhibition. Gretchen Bender is an artist who's well affiliated with the picture generation. She died in 2012, and basically we rescued her work that was in storage, and we convened an exhibition that ended up going back to the kitchen. So these were works that she made in the 80s. She worked with Robert Longo at the time in Rear Cartier Venezia with her studio assistant. And so it's great to be able to be in nowhere's Wisconsin, in rural Wisconsin, to originate an exhibition that's the blind spot of New York and have it come back to New York. So that's the goal of this project. And I'm back at the classroom. So it's been 6 years, and this is my multi-level painting class at the School of the Art Institute. And we just finished up Crit, so I thought this was timely.
Cool. Thank you. That was nice. So I'm gonna try to show a lot of images in a really condensed time frame. When we talk about the conversation, I was thinking, well, how do I, in some way, illustrate that or show images that would maybe reflect the residue of that conversation, or maybe where it happens. And so in selecting these images, I kind of gave myself 3 criteria, because that was a really broad way of trying to visualize that conversation. And so there are images of artwork from me or someone else. The studio, so in the studio building or within the actual space itself. works that never made it out of the studio. And then the third criteria is the campus. So in some way, activities that were happening while I was learning in a really serious institution. Except for the first image, which is actually in Virginia. That's about half an hour from where I grew up. And then I came to Detroit. So some of you may not recognize this campus. This was in 2003. And then this is what I was doing when I arrived. I spent 2 years in industrial design, automotive design. And then after I redesigned the Batmobile, I did an exterior studio, and then I went to painting with Nancy Mitter. And then Cheeto Johnson, his Multiplicity project, I did a cast of these palettes, and so they're all plaster. We could talk about that at another time. This is very embarrassing for me because this is all really the budding, the early stuff. And this was Piquette Market, which was not a Studebaker factory. Basically, the footprint of Piquette was the footprint of CCS's campus, including the parking structure, and it burnt up, and that was crazy. This was a landscape painting on Belle Isle. And then when I got my senior studio, I nailed a pillow to the wall and I framed it. And then this was a critique. I don't know whose crit this was, but Joe Bernard and Gilda and Cheeto, a bunch of classmates. And then this was where the sculpture studio is now, was actually a part of my senior studio. And so I don't know what I was doing. This was a trip to New York with Robert Irwin. I was painting cardboard boxes, which I would think was my first sound piece because I had like a rapper, Nas, of part of his lyrics repeated over and over. This was in the Russell Industrial Center when it was introduced to us. We did a show in Cheeto's advanced sculpture class. And then this was Cave when we first moved in. This is me and Nate Morgan building Cave. And then this is the burnout furnace and the foundry. So if you've ever curious about what it looked like underneath, I don't know if you are or not, or if you know where that is. This is bringing it in. Nikki, Todd Erickson, Graham White. And then I was making steel sort of polyhedrons. And then in the Russell, making work. And then this was a mold. And then this is the work that came out of the mold. This is my friend Nate again. And then I went to Yale. And then friends at Yale at school having conversations. And then this was one of the first works that I made when I was there. One of the parties I DJ'd. Putting material on the roof of a friend's car. And then an installation. This was my first sort of real crit conversation. It got shut down. Jessica Stockholder was actually like, we can't have this ice do this in this space because facilities and the school would be very upset. And then this was another happening. And then this is the first iteration of a performance I did called I Want My Spot Back. This is while I was still in school. This was my second studio in school. Sing. Creative Works. And this is a work. And then this is after the Halloween party. Police shut it down. I was Michelle Obama, so I still had my lipstick on. And then this was in preparation for my thesis. And this was another work. Another project. And then this is the second iteration of I Want My Spot Back, but it was at dance-based projects in St. Mark's Church in New York. And then that's the thesis exhibition. That's the motor that was being hoisted. I graduated. Those are my parents and my brother. And then I had to get a job. So I was a crate shop technician, and when we moved shops, I pulled back one of the panels, and this was what was below the chop saw. It was a crate. And then at the same time, I was invited to be in a group show at the Studio Museum in Harlem called Four. So I made that work for that. And then that fall, I performed the third iteration of I Want My Spot Back at MoMA in the atrium. And then I got a studio in Brooklyn, made some more work. And then this was another installation for a project the following summer. And then this was this past winter, a project I did at Casey Kaplan Gallery in New York. And then the biennial, those shows opened up at the same time. And these were the works for the biennial at the Whitney. This was also an installation in the lobby gallery. And a performance. And then during this time, for the past year, I was at the Studio Museum in Harlem as artist in residence, and this was a work that had sort of accumulated the movement, the bodies, the working process of being in the studio, and then for the final, it was on the floor actually in my studio, and then for the exhibition that opened up, we mounted it on the wall. And then this was a couple weeks ago, I did a performance in Vancouver for another sound work. And that's it.
Thank you both. Thank you, and in my haste to think about conversations where art students start, I forgot that where we were supposed to start, which is with your own introduction, so thank you both for giving us context to how you work and how you think to set the stage for the conversation. So at this point, we will move to the critique, and I'm struck by the fact that you're returning to teaching after a period away and showing us your students, and then you reflecting back in those images on early critiques, it looked like, where it's really was probably very formative in many ways. So if you both could talk a little bit, I know you have a lot of perspectives as people in critiques, as educators trying to help students move forward in a critique, and talk to us a little bit about what you think those conversations need in order to be productive for students and to work well. Maybe we'll start with you, Michelle.
Sure. It's important to know that critiques take different form. So there's the one-on-one, and I've continued to do that. Even though I'm back in the undergrad classroom, I've been teaching at Yale and Bard and the Art Institute, working with graduate students in a one-to-one situation. But I think finally, regardless of what form, and whether it's undergrad or grad, as a faculty or as a visitor, we're context giving. And that context may be locating a practice in a political frame, a philosophical frame, maybe a literary frame, a formal frame, and ideally all of those. You want to be generous enough to unpack something and to start pointing out these other doorways that artists can think about it. But yes, it really is about context. I mean, sometimes it's just, the obvious, well, do you know this person? You should go look at their work, to have you read Beckett lately? And that's really important, to kind of pry open context.
Yeah. And Kevin, maybe you could reflect a little bit on the role that the artist or the student artist has in that. There's a way in which I think outsiders can come in and help set a context, but then it's sort of incumbent on the artist too to have a role in that conversation.
Right. I find that from the crits that I would be in conversation, whether it was my own or it was a peer, was one thing that I kind of stick to is this sort of vulnerability. You're already vulnerable because you're putting your work on the wall and you're asking everyone in a very public way to speak about or maybe project, to like think about your concerns, but then also they can be quite revealing because sometimes people see things that you don't as an artist or that you don't when you're working in the studio, and it's that moment of kind of when you begin to reflect on what it is you've been doing. And I think that vulnerability is actually where you get to something. Like that's actually where the conversation begins to really open up. Like, okay, wait a minute, we're trying to read between the lines here, but let's just like open it up and talk about what it is. And I think as a student, so like probably for the past 10 years, more than half of it, I've been a student. So then thinking about, as a student, it's scary and it's really terrifying, but it's also the most generative because you're actually focused on the work, where it comes from, what decisions are maybe inherent to your nature as an artist, the way that you're working. But then it lets the work exist as it is, so that you as an individual aren't necessarily preceding the work. You're not trying to put some projected image out there that really doesn't hold water. No one's really interested in that unless that is what you are, and it's impenetrable, and that's the sort of conceptual basis of the work. But I think generally you want, in these critiques, it's very revealing when you're vulnerable, but it's also it's just so generative, I find. I mean, that's just from my experience. Mm-hmm. And those that put up the sort of blockage or these walls, I think find a hard time. I think one thing with young artists that's probably the peak challenge over everything is not being discouraged. And that comes from so many different angles. And I think it's really important that, okay, we're here, let's be very generous about that, and let's really get to the hard questions.
And I'm glad you brought up the idea of vulnerability, because it's one that I think will keep coming up as we talk. There's a certain kind of vulnerability that happens in a critique and a certain risk-taking that can happen in school that shifts once an artist conversation moves from the art school context into, say, a studio visit or a talk with a curator. And I think I'd like to get to those in a minute, but I wanted to cycle back to something, Kevin, that you had mentioned when we talked once before, which is you had talked about the art school critique being an opportunity to really hone one's skills at looking,
right,
and hone one's skills at language. And both of those things, you had talked about them really as skill building. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about how that happens or the importance that you see in that, or sort of help share some awareness around building those skills.
Right. Well, I think like half the battle is actually knowing how to approach the work or looking. And this is not only from like an artist viewpoint as like a maker, but then also as like an audience when you're walking into a space and people, you constantly hear like, I don't get it. I remember a lot of crits, they're like, okay, these are cardboard boxes, paint on the ground, I don't get it. And that conversation, that sort of response is really a dead end to say like, okay, I don't get it. And it's like, well, yeah, but how do we then open ourselves up to that? And I think a lot of it is sort of building that skill to look and to say, okay, we would do this actually at Yale in the sculpture department, is that sometimes the conversation would go directly to really philosophical points or really conceptual heavy points, and no one would even address the fact that like, well, but that's wood or something, or that's red. Why is that red and this is blue and then that's white? Or like looking at these colors, or looking at really sort of basic looking foundational, and it doesn't always apply with every work because sometimes it's performative, sometimes there isn't anything to look at. But I think beginning to say, okay, it starts with us entering into the room, and how you build that language from your approach, what you're bringing to it. You know, you have a bad day, you're like, I don't feel like sitting for 2 hours and having this conversation. It's like being cognizant of that and saying, okay, I have to manage that in some way in this conversation, because for the sake of the group and where everyone else is coming from, we have to. It's supposed to be constructive, and I think that you develop that in critiques in art school. And I don't know how much it develops outside of that in terms of looking.
Well, that's what I kind of wanted to ask. Maybe, Michelle, you could talk about that, which is, as a curator, doing a studio visit with an artist, could you talk to us a little bit about how you might look differently as a curator, or how you might think and talk differently than you might if you were an educator in a critique, like how that conversation starts to shift?
Yeah, and it's a big shift, quite honestly. I think I still look intently, and all the information of the studio, whether it's the artist language, whether it's the debris on the floor, whether it's the work on the wall, whether it's how it's put on the wall in terms of display, that's all, again, a kind of content that I can respond to. You know, what Kevin's talking about in terms of these forms of critique that happen in school, they really happen in a bubble. You do not have, I've never experienced as a curator or a critic going into a studio, or having critics and curators come into my studio, the same kind of dynamics that Kevin was describing. You know, it's my belief, as both an artist and somebody who was, again, engaged in the role of a curator or critic, is that I ask questions. I will come into the studio and I'll ask questions of both the material, the cardboard, and those philosophical underpinnings. I don't believe, as a curator, I'm in there to make judgment call or critical calls. And if I'm confused about something, or if I'm leaning towards something, if I'm actually making, for instance, a Whitney Biennial, I did have to select work, not only just the artist, but I was selecting work. And I was leaning to one over the other, and the artist was preferring something. It would be much more of a dialectic than it would be a direct call. I wanted that conversation to be had. But finally, that's not my role as an educator in critiques. It's not always the form of question. I do make judgment calls. There's power dynamics and again, all of those psychological underpinnings that Kevin was talking about. But that happens in the bubble at school, and it does not happen once one is out of school and one is anticipating a visit by a curator. There's still power dynamics that happen, it was Jeremy Gilbert Roth who said, when you have a curator come into your studio, you have to make sure they're there for 40 minutes, because the first 20 minutes you're not going to get anywhere, and that basically is the sniffing around. That's just kind of looking and trying to understand what that space is. Yeah.
Right.
Was there something that you wanted to add?
No, I mean that's definitely my experience, and that overlap that I saw happen when I was in graduate school, when I was actually talking to both curators and other artists, you can see it was like, all right, how do I gauge this person when they're coming? What do they, like you kind of feel like there's like a prep because they come from a different place, and the artists were actually a lot harder on you. Like I had Kenneth Goldsmith in my studio, and he was just like, blah, blah, blah. He just went off. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Because he's an artist, and his approach is that he's looking at it, he's able to sort of judge, and he understands what that structure is or that bubble is. And I think that as a curator, unless you have a background like Michelle of being an artist, then you don't really know what that dynamic is in the studios as much when you're in art school. But then realizing coming out that the conversations that I was having with other curators and people who are interested in the work for, whether it was collectors, that conversation is just, it's very, very different. And in some way I felt like, okay, I'm sort of prepared and sort of developing the language around my work, things that I want to speak about, that I want to put emphasis on, because sometimes there is a predetermined or a predetermined notion about what the work is coming into it. So yeah, but it's a very different experience.
We've also talked kind of in planning for this conversation a little bit about the different responsibilities that the participants of the conversation have. So we have been thinking about kind of the role of the curator and maybe the responsibility that they have when they go to see an artist. But I wonder if either of you could share what you think the responsibility of the artist is in engendering a fruitful conversation and a useful conversation in preparing for a studio visit, whether it's with a collector or a curator.
Right. I mean, I think, I don't know. I automatically go to this Hennessy Youngman video where he talks. It's like his art thoughts. Can you guys hear me? This thing is good. Where he's like, you should provide snacks and you should make it comfortable, or you should do really don't like work all the way up to the moment of the studio visit, and you should it's nothing is that pressing that you have to do at the moment someone is coming to your studio. I think that those points are actually really, really good, because it's just saying, just relax and just sort of be yourself in that situation. But yeah, I mean, that's what
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, if you get to that point where, I think to even extend it a little further, not only listen but learn. Right, that you have somebody else coming in who's bringing in a different set of conditions, a different kind of understanding of your work. They probably have done a great deal of research and seen your work in different contexts before, but maybe have never stepped foot in the studio. And that you have to be receptive to what that visitor is saying, and to have a back and forth. I think the worst thing you can do is kind of shut them down with a couple sound bites. We kind of hang on to those; they make us feel secure, but those are the things that will not yield a learning, something that happens in that space of that visit. There was a curator friend, who was in Texas, who told me he actually prefers the artist to say very little, because there's so much information being generated in the context of this studio, and that he wants to be able to kind of piece it together. He has an idea anyways, and then also, and not make your studio into a small little gallery, because that really limits the amount of information. I mean, display again is important. Artists think about their work in context, on how it circulates, how it looks in any kind of given space. But to actually, it's okay to have those drawings out there that you're a little insecure about, that you're not quite sure if they're successful, because they will help with that conversation.
And knowing that there are student artists in the room, I know that this wisdom is appreciated, as they might anticipate having a visit with a curator or collector. If we reverse that and thought about what wisdom you might share with collectors, for instance, that are coming to an artist studio, and how they might approach a conversation either in preparation or in the moment of being in the studio.
It's always nice, I don't know, I think it's always nice when a collector comes into the studio and they're very respectful of the objects and the things that are in the space. Like just coming in and being, I don't know, being curious in a way that isn't too much like handling things, yeah, I've had a few experiences like that, where I like for things to be touched, but it's also kind of, because the studio visit is really particular for me, it's a space where you don't get to see the work in that context at any other point other than that space. So I do things in the studio that I wouldn't do outside of that. So when people come to the studio, I like to hand objects to them, or I like to, I don't know, I'd show them things, peripheral notes, or whatever's present in that space. But it's still on my terms, because it's the space that I'm it's my space. It's really intimate. The invitation is there. But in terms of advice, I mean, I think that's as much as I could really give, because I think that one thing that's really good is most collectors come in and they know what they're there for, and they've had some information already provided to them in some way. So that preparation, I haven't had instances where a collector would come in and not know what they're stepping into.
Yeah, and to elaborate on that, I also think it's not only does one have to be respectful of the things in the studio, but I've had many people pop out their phones to take photographs of various things, curiosities, the brushes on the pot on my tabaret, and one should ask.
Before a photograph. Point taken.
Yes,
Right.
please.
Yeah. I know that Becky and Michelle would also like to take questions from the audience in just a few minutes. And so I think the method for that was going to be white cards that would be written out, and they would come towards us that we could take those. So I think Becky and Taria will probably circulate those. If you're interested in asking questions of the panel, I think that's how we'll do it. So kind of look for white cards that might be coming down. I'm blinded a little bit by the overhead lights, but that's what I've been told. But as we wait for those, I wanted to think about conversations that happen in a more abstract way. So we're really talking about now conversations between people, between artists and critique, or artists and collectors in the studio. But I'm also thinking about how conversations happen for a field, and how they start to get set by exhibitions or curators who are writing and developing new language, so that a conversation really becomes not about an individual's work, but about maybe a state of the field. And I'm thinking about biennials and how biennials can start to galvanize a set of ideas in a really public way, in a way that everyone can get access to them. And I wondered if you could talk about either moments that you've seen this happen, shows where you've seen this happen, where the conversation really moves beyond an individual, but to something that's salient for a larger community.
Yeah, and I think that's where the biennials or the triennials really do their work. As much as they're easy to they're easy to look at in terms of representation, exclusivity, and really starting to kind of unpack it as a show. They actually do this kind of broad sweep, right? You know, what is in terms of the Whitney Biennial? What is contemporary American art? What is America? I mean, can you move to Canada? Can you go down into Mesoamerica? I mean, in terms of asking that question, but they still do this kind of generalizing that we don't see happen a lot in other kinds of curated programs. And we were talking, I think when we were talking on with our phone conversation about the Unmonumental show, maybe being the last or one of the few exhibitions that started to put a big contour around the idea of the aggregate in terms of object making. So we don't see a lot of that. So that's why the biennial or triennials are important, because they do create this kind of generalized loop that helps us kind of enter into and identify some of those discourses that are pulsing through, a big geography or a big body of work.
Yeah.
Right. And how they how deep are they invested? Because what's you then have a marker that after that, what precedes it, you can see how even artists respond and move through materially, or where they're located, where the work goes after that. And I think that's really important with these kinds of shows that do provide just like a marker to say, okay, this is what's happening around this time. Here are some artists that are here. Because then things can shift really fast. I mean, I feel like this stuff is moving so quickly anyway, which is kind of the rate of society now is really picking up. And so not having those markers, I thought it was really great the way that the Whitney sort of approach. Maybe people will feel differently about this, but the way that the Whitney approached the last biennial by dividing the floors and saying, okay, you have 3 distinct personalities that are going to go in and actually curate their sensibilities, but then the Whitney as an institution is still saying, well, this is how we're thinking about surveying, is that there will be a lot of imperfections and they're going to come from really particular viewpoints, but that ultimately is what we're looking at. And then it's just contingent upon people coming in and focusing on the work itself and what that's doing, and then that sort of framing allows for that marker, allows for us to see what's happening in the States, without necessarily putting a theme like unmonumental out in the ether. It allows it to have a little bit more fluidity. It allows us to say, okay, you can build your own sort of markers within that, but there's still a fat catalog that has all that work in it. And I think that's really important. I also think about my time at the Studio Museum, that being a very, very specific conversation that exists, entering into that program and having my work within the context of that history, that neighborhood, being able to work in Harlem, predominantly Black, the exhibitions, the museum itself having a mission to serve artists of color is, for me, that context is really important because the work that I'm doing doesn't always speak to the stereotypical points. And so the framing of that then allows that to be associated, allows what we think about that identity or what we think about that thought or that theme or that idea, that it's malleable and it can change.
I want to underscore one thing that you said about the Whitney Biennial in terms of the layer cake effect that 2014 had, the last biennial in the Breuer building, and that is it also implicated curating for the first time, right? By having 3 curators who were assigned and not kind of blended. I mean, there have been many group curatorial biennial projects before, but kind of slotting each curator in a kind of geography within the building allowed the discussion of curating, which is, as we know within the contemporary landscape, curating is very defining. So that implicated curating as well as, again, a kind of survey. Really smart.
Yeah, I think it's a great point.
Yeah.
I did get a couple of questions from the audience a couple minutes earlier. If there are others, I'm happy to take them. I see some white cards being kind of flashed around in the back. Let's see. This is sort of there's a question here that could probably be broken into 2 parts. But the first one I think probably is for you, Michelle, which is, could you tell us a little bit about the conversations that developed between the 3 curators at the Whitney Biennial, and to what degree there was conversation between the 3, and sort of how that unfolded?
Sure, and a very good question, and one that often goes unaddressed. And I think it's a surprising answer, and the fact is we had very little conversation. At the very get-go, one of our very first meetings, Elizabeth Sussman and Jay Saunders, who were responsible for the 2012 biennial, told us that, you know, we did put forward in the press this layer cake scenario, that you would each get a floor. However, if you didn't want to do that, if you wanted to work together, as in past group curatorial projects, you could do that. And I was really adamant about not, that I did sign myself up for taking on a little miniature biennial, and Stuart and Anthony would each take on their little miniature biennial as well. And again, curating would be part of that. And that was very important in terms of how I thought about contemporary discourse and again, implicating curating. So the answer to that question is we talked very little. We talked about redundancy. If Kevin was on my list as well as Stuart's list, what would that mean? And I argued that that would be fantastic, where Kevin would be in different contexts on my floor versus Stuart's floor. It never happened that there was no redundancy actually with artists, but that was a question that the institution had because they were afraid that if we all came to your studio, Sarah, and then you weren't on anybody's floor, you weren't invited, that you would be crushed. So it's very funny how the institution really cares about feelings for artists. I think in a very backward way as an artist myself, but they do keep that in mind. So answer, very little conversation. We became close. We would compare notes just in terms of how things were working out, who was working, in terms of schedule, but otherwise, we had to come together on the catalog design. That was about it.
Thank you. Kevin, I have a question from the audience for you, and it's asking for you to please talk about how documentation of your performances and your participatory and ephemeral work serves you. How do you navigate the need to be able to show what you've done, and the desire, at the same time, have a desire to retain the immediacy and the fluidity of the experiences of your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Documentation, obviously there's images from my time at CCS, so I always had a camera, and now that's different. That was different in 2003 than it is now. But I feel like for the performances, the documentation, I got really lucky. Because some of the first performances that I did were within institutions. And when I was in school, I was at Yale, I had bought a camera and I had just asked my peers to take photos while I was performing, and so they did. And from there, it became really important to not only find someone to document this, but for me to also think about through notes how that can be imaged or communicated later on. And it's still like a really long process, but now I have the support of a gallery that helps sort of organize that. So a lot of the performances that I do now are documented with video. And a lot of the ephemeral works, I think that in terms of, I don't really show the videos that often, but I do the editing myself, so I can have some sort of creative control over how it looks, the way that it's, maybe the timing of it. If I want to edit things out, I can do that. Like I've done something really specific where some of these videos, since a lot of the work that I do is sound-based, I'll just like make a black point in it, so you'll be listening and the video will cut out. So there's small things that I do within that I'm gradually getting the hang of in terms of documenting the work, and then in some way trying to add the sensibility of what the work is itself. But ultimately, it's not going to be the thing itself. So beyond some of the photos and maybe an audio recording, that's strictly all of the evidence. I mean, there's a document that goes along with everything that I do. I try to write notes of, am I, or that contain certain questions like, is this really important that I'm performing it? Can it be someone else? Mm-hmm. If someone else were to perform it, what kind of note, what would I tell them? Maybe if the work goes into a collection, and it is reperformed, and I could like rise from the dead and say something to them, like what would I say? So those things I try to keep, I actually try to keep records of those.
Thanks. I think we'll take one more question in the interest of being careful about our time. I realize I asked for questions and I got a lot of them. Unless Michelle gives me the nod that we can go longer, I'll probably just take one more. And it's a very, very good one, and I think it does a really nice job of sort of inverting this conversation, which is a question for you, Michelle. What does a curator learn from curating a biennial? What are the byproducts of the curatorial experience for you, the risks, the projections, the strategies that you might have learned?
Yeah, I was talking to Kevin about this earlier. I learned a lot about the institution, not necessarily an institution of curating, but the institution itself. So I worked with, Adam Weinberg is an amazing director. There's great curators. But then there's the institution, this abstract thing that has a lot of power and sway and weight. In terms of curating the biennial, when I was able to stretch that institution, I felt I was doing something valuable as an artist. Mostly it snapped back and said no to me. That was the majority of time. But there was this back and forth that would happen. And one example, I want to give one example, the inclusion of an artist named Philip Vanderheiden, a young artist based in New York, who remade a Gretchen Bender piece. It's that big, long, black plastic thing that had glowing movie titles in. And he made it authentically. This is a piece that was destroyed, never kind of made it to the day. And so he worked with people who were part of the making, Rearcrit, Robert Longo, very authentically trying to remake it. And the museum was not, couldn't understand, first of all, why an artist would want to authentically, carefully remake a piece that existed in the past, this People in Pain, but they couldn't understand how it would be valued then. So there's a committee, and maybe the DIA also has a committee, but it's the Committee of Replication, and it has lawyers, curators, registration. So I had to go in front of this committee and really argue that this piece was being remade, it would maintain its value, and that Philip, the artist who remade it, would actually be an artist included in the biennial. That is what they couldn't understand, why he would be a biennial artist.
Right.
So these things, which I think as artists, we think, well, that's, of course. But institutions don't think that way. They think very differently. So it was this back and forth, and again, I feel great pride in having, their eyes light up when I said, no, this is an artist who's remaking it, it's not you, the institution. In the end, they didn't acquire the piece, so they were interested, and it's only because they, again, could not assign value to it. They could not figure out what the value of this thing would be with, again, another artist, a younger artist remaking it. So that was just one example of kind of many, I would say, yeah.
Wrestling the institution.
Wrestling with the institution.
Yeah. I want to give both of you the opportunity, if there's things that kind of came and went too quickly that you felt like you wanted to share this evening, questions that I didn't give you enough time to answer. If there's anything that you want to add to any of the conversation that we've had so far, I think that would be a nice way to close.
No, I don't know. I feel like there's so much.
I'll pop in just because it's always maybe dangerous, but always good to leave with a cliche. I mean, I think when you have somebody come into your studio, whether you're in school or whether you're out of school and if somebody's visiting, you see it as a long conversation that is part of a conversation that's going to last you a lifetime. If you start thinking of it as a means to an end, Michelle Grabner's coming to your studio and gosh darn, I want to be included in the biennial and I will do backflips for that to happen. The chance of that happening were small at the get-go because curators go into a lot of studios, particularly for biennials. But who knows down the line when that curator is going to be working with you again. So really leave yourself open. It's an ongoing conversation. You don't think of it as, don't let anybody leave your studio and think, oh, that was terrible, I did terribly. You can't if you are yourself, if you're open to a conversation and set up a dialectic, that's how you have to move forward. That's how we move forward as artists. That's how you have to move forward with language and these kind of conversations with other professionals.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice note to think about the fact that this is not a conversation that happens once.
No.
It's really a conversation that unfolds over a lifetime, both with individuals and kind of with your own work as you just keep moving.
Yes.
And I know tonight we've probably raised as many questions as we've answered. We didn't get to all of them on the cards, but I hope that you'll continue to talk to yourselves. I hope that you'll come back to the next series of events because this conversation will, I'm sure, keep kind of folding in as we go forward. So thank you very much. And thank you to Kevin and Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, Michelle, and Kevin, for this conversation. I want to remind everyone of our next event on November 23rd when Sarah Thornton will be here in conversation with Vince Carducci about the role of the artist. Thanks for being with us tonight.